Welcome to Chapter 7, Nonverbal Codes and Cultural Space. In this chapter, we're looking at how verbal and nonverbal communication differ and the types of communications that are expressed nonverbally. We'll talk about cultural universals in nonverbal communication, as well as differences and how those cross-cultural research findings are limited. We'll talk about cross-cultural differences in things like facial expressions, proxemics, gestures, eye contact, paralanguage, chronemics, and silence. And we'll talk about, of course, issues of communication and power with nonverbal expression. And we'll talk about this idea of cultural space and why it's important to understand cultural space in intercultural communication. And ultimately, we'll end with a brief discussion of the difference between modernist and postmodern views of cultural spaces. So first, defining nonverbal communication. There are two forms of communication beyond speech that we typically talk about in intercultural communication. The first includes those issues of facial expression, personal space, gestures, eye contact, paralanguage, use of time, and conversational silence. The second is this issue of cultural spaces that people occupy and negotiate. Cultural spaces are the social and cultural contexts in which people's identity forms, right? Where they grow up, where they live, where they interact. When we talk about verbal versus nonverbal communication, both are symbolic. That is, they both rely on symbols to communicate meaning, and they both have patterns. That is, they're going by different rules of expectations for communication. So societies have different nonverbal languages just as they have different spoken languages. However, some differences between nonverbal and verbal communication codes have important implications for intercultural interaction. That makes sense, I hope. Although people learn rules and meanings for language, behavior, and grammar and language arts lessons, that is, we take an ELA or English course and we learn things about grammar and what words mean and how to spell things, we typically learn nonverbal meanings and behaviors by more implicit socialization. Generally, people's nonverbal behaviors reinforce their verbal behaviors. That is, we use our nonverbal cues to emphasize or signify what our verbal communications mean. But sometimes, of course, nonverbal communication happens without any kind of verbal expression. For example, somebody says something and you roll your eyes. That is conveying a clear message in reaction to a verbal cue. So, what does nonverbal behavior communicate? Although language is an efficient and effective means of communicating explicit information or content, every communication also conveys relational messages, that is, information on how the talker wants to be understood and viewed by the listener. Nonverbal behavior communicates status and power, right? It communicates status is your situation inside that context, and power is how much power you have in that particular context. In addition, many people believe that nonverbal behavior communicates deception. That is, we oftentimes use nonverbal communication typically unconsciously or subconsciously, to communicate um, things that may or may not be related to our explicit verbal cues. That is, for example, making a particular expression when you say something might indicate that it's a joke, right? And so that way it's deceptive. But also something as typical as the clothes you wear can present a particular image that may not be representative of kind of a true identity or true self. Think about wearing your best clothes to show up to a job interview, and on the day-to-day basis, you're a jeans and t-shirts kind of person, right? So there is some level of deception. And once again, it can be conscious. It can be we are trying to do it, or it can be subconscious or unconscious. That is, that you're completely or somewhat unaware of what you're communicating. Most nonverbal communication about affect, status, and deception happens at an unconscious level. So, a useful theory in understanding nonverbal communication across cultures is the expectancy violations theory. And that is that just like with language, we can kind of predict what we expect to come next in a conversation or even next in a sentence. We have those same kind of expectations, typically on an unconscious level, that how we expect people to act and communicate non-verbally. A good example of that from the book is about personal space. and that can be a positive or a negative communication, right? So if you are interacting with somebody who is more comfortable being in closer spaces than you are because they are in a culture that interacts in with less personal space, it can make you uncomfortable, right? If you're not with that. But if it's somebody that you like and you're in a social situation and they enter your personal space, you might see that as a positive cue that they're interested in you, and then you might engage in that, right? So we could violate expectations, and how we interpret those violations is how we give meaning to those symbolic actions. So the universality of nonverbal behavior. So just like we talk about the universality of some fundamental features of language, even when languages differ across cultures, there are things like facial expressions that appear to be universal. So most traditional research in intercultural communication focuses on identifying cross-cultural differences in nonverbal behavior. But it's neither beneficial nor accurate to try to reduce individuals to one element of an identity, right? So gender, all women use nonverbal behavior in this particular way. Well, that's certainly not true, right? Or ethnicity, all people from Latin America use nonverbal behavior in a particular way, or nationality, right, from a particular country, and so on. Attempts to place people in discrete categories tends to reduce them and their complexities, and can lead to major misunderstandings. So we've been talking about this idea of intersectionality, how we're not just one identity, right? We're a culmination of many different identities, some that are more significant and more important in our identity development, and some that are less important, some that we're more conscious of, and some that we're less conscious of, some that we work to improve or develop, and some that kind of happen naturally. Individuals often classify others according to various categories to help them find universalities, right? So you might say, well, it's typical of people from this particular region to do these things, right? It's a typical expression. And that can be useful, right? But it can also be problematic. So you have to be careful not to apply it to avoid stereotyping, of course. Some recent research findings. So, research investigating the universality of nonverbal communication is focused on four areas. So, the relationship of human behavior to that of primates, particularly chimpanzees. So, it's interesting, right, to see and consider how much of our nonverbal communication might be something that is genetic, right, and something that is biological, and that's how we express ourselves as humans, and how similar or different that might be from animals. Nonverbal communication of sensory deprived children who are blind or deaf. So consider something like facial expressions for people who have grown up blind. So they have no um, cue, they haven't learned a cue by seeing other people's faces and learning how to express what might be considered appropriate in a normative situation. Um, so if somebody who is blind shows us facial expression naturally that matches that of normative abled vision people, then that suggests something about kind of our biological connection to nonverbal communication and behavior. Facial expressions in general can be interesting because many facial expressions appear to be universal. Of course, there others are not, or may have different meanings in different contexts. And the universal functions of nonverbal social behavior, that is functions. So, why do we do what we do? What is um, the result of particular facial expressions and proxemics and things, and how that impacts social behavior? So many cross-cultural studies support the notion of some universality and function of nonverbal communication, particularly in facial expressions. For example, the eyebrow flash, the nose wrinkle, or the disgust face. These are facial expressions that have been observed across many, many cultures, and then therefore are thought not only that all humans make these facial expressions universally, but they carry a very similar meaning in different cultures. So, although research may indicate universalities in nonverbal communication, some variations definitely exist. The evoking stimuli, what causes the nonverbal behavior, may vary from one culture to another, right? As simply as the thing that we are disgusted by can be significantly different depending on our culture and our cultural spaces. Although research may indicate it is important to look for larger cultural patterns and nonverbal behavior. So while it's interesting to look across cultures, it's also interesting to look within cultures to identify cultural patterns. Um, Not necessarily identify all these individual differences, but how all these individual differences suggest a pattern of communication. And then moving beyond that to connect that nonverbal communication to verbal communication in a particular culture. Thinking about nonverbal codes, the book goes through these pretty quickly, but the idea is just to get you to start thinking about what kind of information you communicate and others communicate non-verbally. So, physical appearance is an important nonverbal code. It includes physical characteristics like height, weight, and body shape, as well as personal grooming, including body hair, clothing choices, tattoos, and then even personal artifacts like jewelry, glasses, and backpacks, briefcases, purses, medical facial masks, right, which is a big one. Um, having gone through a pandemic and still emerging from that pandemic, right, and people who still choose to wear a mask versus people who don't choose to wear masks, and how that communicates particular information, right, to those we interact with. But you can think about how issues like height and weight and body shape, a lot of times we tend to think like universally there's an ideal version like of how tall someone is supposed to be or not supposed to be, or how heavy or what their body shape is supposed to be. um, but those things can differ dramatically across cultures. What is kind of the idealized version of what counts as beautiful, right? um, and same thing with grooming. You can see that in the United States, where in some cultures within the United States, maybe long hair is valued, or maybe short hair is valued, maybe natural hair is valued. Um, and so just starting to think about how these different aspects of how we present ourselves and who we are physically communicates particular information. During the past 60 years, psychologist Paul Ekman and colleagues, through extensive and systemic research, have maintained that there are six basic emotions expressed through universal facial expressions: happiness, sadness, disgust, surprise, anger, and fear. What this suggests is that wherever you are, there are particular facial expressions that everyone will recognize as conveying a particular emotive state. And that's interesting to think, right? So maybe these aren't necessarily purely culturally developed, right? That we didn't learn these behaviors, but these behaviors might have a biological basis. And it's something that connects us as humans rather than separates us as people of different cultures. Unlike facial expressions, the norms for personal space seems to vary considerably from culture to culture. Proxemics is the study of how people use various types of space in their everyday lives. Fixed feature space, semi-fixed space, and informal space are three kind of terms we can use to discuss this. So fixed feature space is characterized by set boundaries, divisions within an office building, for example, right? You have your cubicle or you have your office, that is kind of your space and it's defined, it's fixed, right? Semi-fixed feature space is defined by fixed boundaries such as furniture, right? So you can set up your classroom in a way in which the teacher is set apart by a podium at the front while the students are collected together in rows of desks. Informal space or personal space is characterized by a personal zone or bubble that varies for individuals and circumstances. So it's important to note that while there might be typical cultural expectations about personal space, it can vary significantly by individuals. And you might know people, for example, who say, "Oh, I'm a hugger," right? And they go in for a hug, even if that makes you uncomfortable personally, right? That's kind of at that individual level. Whereas in some groups, for example, I'm in Spain right now, so people might every time you greet somebody new, you give them two kisses, a kiss on each cheek, and that is typical, right? And that's a much closer personal space than the United States, where normally you meet somebody, you give a handshake, right? Which is even closer than in some Asian countries where personal contact is not common, and instead you might bow and not make physical contact, right? So there's like levels of that bubble that can be cultural and can be individual. According to Edward Hill, Contact cultures are those societies in which people stand closer together while talking, engage in more direct eye contact, use face to face body orientations more often while talking, touch more frequently, and speak in louder voices. Non contact cultures are those societies in which people tend to stand further apart when conversing, maintain less eye contact, and touch less often. Gestures, perhaps even more so than personal space, vary greatly from culture to culture. Um, so you may already know this, but some gestures that are very common in the United States, and I like to use the NSU Forcum because you go to NSU. So the NSU Forcum is seen as the sign of the devil, right? In a lot of cultures, and not to the extent like in the United States where some cultures may be offended by it, but where an entire nationality might be offended by it, in general, right? There might be individuals who don't, right? Individuals who are into heavy metal music, for example, might have embraced that gesture. But that's a gesture that has a significant difference from culture to culture. Eye contact is often included in proxemics, right? Because it regulates interpersonal distance. Direct eye contact shortens the distance between two people, whereas less eye contact increases the distance. Eye contact communicates meanings about respect and status and often regulates turn taking. Patterns of eye contact vary from culture to culture. In many societies, avoiding eye contact communicates respect and deference, although this may vary from context to context, right? So it's important to always remember that even within cultures, there are contexts within which that is different. So the idea of staring into someone's eyes might make them uncomfortable, or it might show interest that then they connect and make eye contact, and leads to something romantic like in the movies, right? But that's a context to context difference as opposed to a cultural difference, where in some cultures it is important that you would defer eye contact from those with higher status and more power in a particular situation. Paralinguistics refers to the study of paralanguage, that is, vocal behaviors that indicate how something is said, including speaking rate, volume, pitch, and stress. Saying something very quickly in a loud tone of voice will be interpreted differently from the same word said in a quieter tone of voice at a slower rate. As I tell my kids all the time, it's not what you said, it's how you say it, right? Voice qualities, or the non-technical term tone of voice, mean the same thing as vocal qualities. Have you ever seen that? Voice qualities include speech, pitch, rhythm, vocal range, and articulation. Vocal range, of course, um, can be the difference between your pitches within a particular statement. Um, these qualities make up the quote music of human language. And in fact, in some cultures and in some languages, things like pitch and rhythm and vocal range and articulation and speed vary because the culture varies, not because an individual's idiosyncratic use of a particular way of speaking. Vocalizations are the sounds people utter that do not have the structure of language. So paralanguage can be a confusing factor in intercultural communication. So what are some things that don't have the structure of language? Well, grunts, for example. Um, the amount of silence in conversations and the rate of speaking differ among different cultures as well. And that's important to note that some cultures value silence while some cultures devalue silence. Chronemics concerns concepts of time and the rules that govern its use. There are many cultural variations regarding how people understand and use time. We talked a little about this a little bit back when we talked about values, and there was some confusion about what people with a short term versus a long term view of time might how they might think about the world or how they might value time, right? So people who are short term oriented want results quickly, and so they might be interested very much in kind of instant and immediate change to achieve whatever effect they want. Religiously, this means something like the ritual of baptism in Christianity, which in that moment then cleanses your soul and prepares you to go uh, to heaven, right? To be embraced by God, right? That is opposed to something like a long-term approach of some Eastern religions that embrace um, the living of multiple lives through which a soul kind of purifies and strengthens itself to be prepared for an afterlife. Um, but in this case, we're talking about nonverbal code. So people have a monochronic concept of time, regard it as a commodity. Time can be gained, lost, spent, wasted, or saved. In this orientation, time is linear, with one event happening each time. In contrast, in a polychronic orientation, time is more holistic and perhaps more circular, and several events can happen at once. Um, so obviously, we live in a world in which we probably mix these two concepts, but there is a driving baseline concept for each culture of how people think about time, whether time is right. And I particularly think about like consumerist and capitalist countries that tend to view everything as a consumable, right? Everything as something that is used, that there's a limited quantity of, right? So you only live this much time. So think about carpe diem poetry, right? Seize the day poetry. That's really all about like we don't have that much time, so let's do it now, right? And that kind of poetry would be typical, right, of a lot of Western cultures, but atypical of a lot of Eastern cultures. Cultural groups may vary in the degree of emphasis placed on silence, which can be meaningful as language. In most US American contexts, silence is not highly valued. Particularly in developing relationships, silence communicates awkwardness and can make people feel uncomfortable. In a review of scholarly research on silence, communication scholar Chris Atchison acknowledges that silence in the United States has often become associated with negative, unhealthy relationships or disempowerment. However, Covarrubias Carball, I just destroyed that name, and other scholars, Atchison encourages us to consider the contribution of positive and sometimes powerful uses of silence in certain contexts, right? So even in societies where silence isn't valued, there can be contexts in which silence is valuable, right? But in some cultures, silence is highly valued. Like it's seen as respectful if you are silent and can wait for the other person to communicate what they have to communicate before then absorbing that and responding. Whereas in the United States, in most cultural contexts, the person who speaks the most is oftentimes seen as the person who knows the most and is the most valuable. You could see that in classrooms where students who are eager to prove themselves will be those who talk the most, right? Once again, there's individual differences, right? Some people are shyer and some people are more expressive, and that can affect individual context. But we're talking about general nonverbal codes. So why do these nonverbal codes matter? Well, they matter the same reason that verbal codes matter, and all this things we've been talking about culture and context, and that is how we perceive others based on stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. So one of the problems with identifying cultural variations in nonverbal codes is that it is tempting to overgeneralize these variations and then stereotype people, right? So if I say, well, it's typical of Asian people to be quieter and observe silence more often, and then I have these expectations, right? And so then when I meet an Asian person who is very expressive and outgoing, right, that violates my expectations and I may perceive that negatively. So we have to be careful, right, to remember that within every culture is built of individuals. So while things may be normative or typical of a particular culture, they are not universal across that culture. And this also matters a lot when we talk about intersectionality. That is, right, if all people of one group, we think they all act in a particular way, right, then we can fall in that trap of, well, that person isn't really a member of that group. They're really something else, right, because they violated that kind of stereotype we've created. So while explicit racial slurs are less common today, a series of recent studies showed that bias, both negative and positive, is demonstrated through subtle facial expressions and body language in popular television programs. So we did that exercise looking at um, characters in popular culture, right, in television programs or movies. But another step of that, right, then is to see how do other characters interact with those characters of minority cultures? What kinds of facial expressions of body language do they use? So um, when you're driving your car through a quote unquote bad section of town, do you lock your doors and roll up your windows when you stop at a stoplight? Well, that might be a practical thing, right, for safety, but it also might just be a nonverbal way in which you are communicating that you are not part of that world and that world is not good enough, right? And is unsafe and all these ideas, right? So remember, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, right? It has to do with how we communicate. And in this case, typically unconsciously or subconsciously. They also view that more viewers watch shows that had pro-white nonverbal bias, and the more biased viewers became, even though they could not consciously identify the biased behaviors they had seen in the program. Right? In other words, uh, viewers can learn additional behaviors by observing them in something as common as a television show. Right? That is the way you're supposed to act around people of this group, even if you didn't explicitly notice it or are able to describe it later. Right? It can still impact your own behavior. Prejudice is often based on nonverbal aspects of behavior. That is, the negative prejudgment is triggered by physical appearance or behavior, right? This is most evident when we encounter people of different races and ethnicities who we perceive immediately as different because of their appearance, right? Um, the trick, right, is not that we're not going to notice that difference, because we're going to notice that difference, right? The trick is that we have to be aware that our recognition of that difference does not lead to stereotyping and then ultimately to discrimination. So, stereotyping or prejudice can lead to overt nonverbal actions to exclude, avoid, or distance. That's called discrimination, right? So, when prejudice and stereotyping lead to some kind of nonverbal or verbal action, right, that is exclusive, then that's discrimination. Discrimination may range from subtle nonverbal behavior, such as lack of eye contact or exclusion from a conversation, to verbal insults and exclusion from jobs and other economic opportunities, to physical violence, and of course, systemic or systematic exclusion. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So, semiotics and nonverbal communication. The study of semiotics or semiology offers a useful approach to examining how different signs communicate meaning. So we talk about um, language. It's easy to see that language is a system of signs, right? Um, that are or a system of signifiers, right? That relate to something that is signified. Okay. So semiosis is the production of meaning and is constructed through interpretation of signs, the combination of signifiers and signified. If you've taken a linguistics class, surely you've heard about this. This is the basis for um, 20th century, first half of the 20th century study of language. So it's structuralism, right? So signifiers are the culturally constructed arbitrary words or symbols people use to refer to something else, right? The signified, which is the actual thing. So, for example, the word man is a signifier that refers to the signified, an adult male human being, like an actual person, right? So it's basically the label that we give things, right? The signifier signifies something, which is the signified, okay? Altogether, we call that a sign. So what I want you to think about, though, is that nonverbal communication is also a series of signs. That is, the clothes we wear are a signifier that signifies something, right? So even if we haven't assigned a word to it, right, there is a sign that is represented by something connected to something it means, right, that it signifies. So that we see somebody wearing a tie, and that tie is not only a tie, a thing, right? But that is also a sign that signifies something about that person that we understand, right? It's signified. So behavior is a series or a system of signs, just like verbal communication is. It's a little bit harder to study, right? Because we have to agree um, to communicate that information verbally, right? Which is typically nonverbal. But something like a smile, if I say the word smile, right, you envision a smile. Well, if you see someone smile, that signifies happiness, for example. Okay. Um, the last idea in the chapter that's really significant is this idea of cultural space. So we've talked a lot about how one's history is important in understanding one's identity. As writer John Preston explains, where we come from is important to who we are. So cultural space influences how people think about themselves and others. The the discourses that construct the meanings of cultural spaces are dynamic and ever changing. So you think about cultural spaces as kind of identifiable contexts. Okay, and we'll talk about some basic versions of that, or foundational versions of that, and then we'll talk about what that means in the postmodern world. So one of the easiest ways to think about cultural identity and cultural space is to think about this idea of home. So one of the earliest cultural spaces people experience is their home. Nonverbal communication often involves issues of status. The home is no exception. Even if one's home does not reflect the social class to which one aspires, it may be a place of identification. People often model their own lives on the patterns from their childhood homes. Although this is not always the case, the home can be a place of safety and security. Home, of course, is not the same as the physical location it occupies or the building, which we might call the house or the apartment, wherever you lived, right? At that location. Home is variously defined in terms of specific addresses, cities, states, regions, and even nations, right? Um, but at its foundation, it's defined by a family structure. And that family structure, as it exists within broader context, right? Moving from home and neighborhood. So, one significant type of cultural space that emerged in U.S. cities in the later 19th and early 20th centuries was the ethnic or racial neighborhood. Historical studies show, however, that the ethnic neighborhoods of the European immigrants were rarely inhabited by only one ethnic group, despite memories to the contrary. So, you might, if you've been to New York, see areas like Chinatown or Little Italy. And this presents the idea that those neighborhoods are homogenous. But they actually tend to be much more heterogeneous than they are homogenous. But the people of those particular cultures often remember them as more homogenous than they actually were. Why? Right? Well, because we are creating within that context a normative understanding of that community, of that neighborhood. There is, of course, a legacy of white only areas that pervades the history of the United States and the development of its cultural geography. Neighborhoods exemplify how power influences intercultural contact. Thus, some cultural groups defined who got to live where and dictated the rules by which other groups lived. These rules were enforced through legal means and by harassment, right? So there were certainly housing laws that discriminated and maintained exclusiveness of non-white families and people moving into particular communities. And we can see how that creates what historically we thought of as ghettos. That's a term that has taken on negative connotations. But so instead, we'll say that has created these neighborhoods, cultural neighborhoods, right? Where people who were non white were pushed to live because they were excluded from living in white only areas. Within the context of different power relations and historical forces, settlement patterns of other culture groups created various ethnic enclaves across the U.S. landscape. And that's why you end up with both segregation and de facto segregation. So, segregation is that legal and by harassing means, uh, kind of whites in the United States, right? White-driven policies and practices of pushing minority groups into particular areas of cities and towns, away from white-only areas, right? Whereas de facto segregation is when people of different cultures perhaps immigrate both within and from outside of the United States and choose to live with people who are like them, right? Because they want those cultural similarities, that cultural comfort of being with other members of the minority group, right? So while it is true, dramatically true in the United States, the segregation has largely been driven by legal means and by means of harassment and explicit bias and prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination. There are also instances where people choose to live with people who are like them. And we see that in newer immigrants to the United States, where sometimes they are economically segregated. That is, they can't afford to live in other areas of the city, but oftentimes they choose to live around people who share a similar minority culture to themselves, particularly if they share a common language that is not English. It makes it easier to communicate and live your daily life, right? But we should recognize these power relations and these historical forces that establish the settlement patterns of other cultural groups, right? The relationships among identity, power, and cultural space are quite complex. Power relations influence who or what gets to claim who or what and under what conditions, right? So this is the issues of power we've been talking about throughout the course. That is, that even if we are unaware of this power structure or we haven't really considered this power structure, it exists in all intercultural interactions. Cultural identity and cultural space, of course, it goes beyond, right? It goes beyond the home, the neighborhood, the state, to even regionalism, right? It can be expressed in many ways, from symbolic expressions of identification even to armed conflict. Within the United States, people may identify themselves or others as Southerners, New Englanders, and so forth, right? New Yorkers is a big one. Texans is another big one. Sometimes people fly regional flags. Think about people who fly the Confederate flag, wear particular kinds of clothes, right? Can you think about some regional some clothing that might define a particular region or area? Celebrate regional holidays. Are there holidays like Mardi Gras that are only celebrated in particular regions, right? And participate in other cultural activities to communicate their regional identification. That can have to do with food ways. That can have to do with different kinds of celebrations. It can even have something to do with what we talked about last week, which is different dialects of the same language, right? National borders may seem straightforward, but they often conceal conflicting regional identities, right? Is there a difference between the people on one side of the border and people on the other side of the border? We can see this in a lot of states where people tend to choose a state around them that represents the less than, right? So I grew up in Virginia, and we oftentimes talked about West Virginians as significantly worse off than we were. They were in our stereotypes. They were poor, less educated, uh, less healthy, right? All these issues, right? Those are stereotypes, right? So part of becoming aware of that is noticing those stereotypes that perhaps we joked about, but unconsciously had an impact on how we might interact with somebody who actually came from West Virginia. In Louisiana, that might be Arkansas or Mississippi, right? Certainly, it's Alabama if you're an LSU fan, right? Um, to understand how intercultural communication may be affected by national borders, one must consider how history, power, identity, culture, and context come into play. We see this in particular between the border of Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and Mexico, right? There's a huge history about separating what is considered a national power in the United States and a third world country in Mexico. What does that mean? We call something a third world country, and how does that impact the way we communicate with members, with citizens of that country, and how we perceive them as immigrants, as opposed to Canada, which borders right the north of the United States. How do we perceive Canadian immigrants versus how we perceive Mexican immigrants, and why? Right. So these are some things that oftentimes we don't think about, um, but can lead to an interesting, better, deeper understanding of how history, power, identity, culture, and context come into play. And only by understanding these issues can we approach the complex process of human communication. And of course, cultural spaces are not just defined by these kind of geographical terms, right? Or defined by the spaces within an office or the way in which we set up a classroom, right? They're also cultural spaces that exist beyond that, right? So people often change cultural spaces when they travel, right? Think about this. Traveling is frequently viewed as an unimportant leisure activity, but it's more important than that. In terms of intercultural communication, traveling changes cultural spaces in ways that often transform the traveler, right? So a lot of times we think about ourselves as this kind of unchangeable, immutable self that's going to interact with the world, and the world is going to kind of adapt around us, or we're going to find a way to make it through without really changing. But what happens in these interactions is oftentimes that we have to adapt to these new cultural spaces in order to enjoy them, right? So if you've ever traveled somewhere and experienced something that was way outside of your contact zone, or maybe just a little bit outside your contact zone, like a new food, right? You have adapted in some way, and your reaction in that experience can be a positive transformation or a negative transformation in relation to that new culture. So changing cultural spaces means changing oneself and how one would interact with others. Globalization and cyberspace can change the way people experience changing cultures. People also change cultural spaces when they relocate. Moving involves different kinds of change in cultural spaces than traveling. So think about traveling, right? You can go, you can experience something, you kind of escape it, right? When you move somewhere, right, you're there, right? And people who migrate do not always seek out that change, right? Oftentimes, as we talked about at the beginning of the class, people are forced to migrate by things like war and weather. Um, or economic conditions, right? Imagine if you lived somewhere where it was a starvation situation, right? What would you do to survive? Well, you might do anything you can to move somewhere where you think you can provide for your family, right? Um, so it's not necessarily a choice to go to a different area, but you must go to that different area. And by going to that different area, you must experience and interact in this new culture, right? So many immigrants leave their homelands simply so they can survive, but they often find it difficult to adjust to the change, especially if the language and customs of the new cultural space are unfamiliar, right? So one thing we can think about as intercultural communicators is how not only we're going to reach out, right, to other cultures outside of our own, but also how we're going to welcome people of other cultures into our own culture. So postmodern cultural spaces is recognizing the shift away from these kind of physically defined, fixed ideas of culture, right? So historically, people were not very mobile, right? Only the really wealthy could travel. Most people were born, grew up, had families, worked, lived, and died in the same basic place, right? That is not true nowadays, particularly in wealthy countries like the United States, where even modestly wealthy families will take perhaps a summer vacation where they travel somewhere, even in the United States or maybe to Mexico or Canada, and experience a very different culture, right? Even if they're going from Louisiana to California or Louisiana to Florida, right? There may be similarities, right? Because we're still in America, but they're different spaces. So this idea that we're more mobile changes the way we think about cultural spaces. What happens when you go to Disney World at Mardi Gras? Well, Disney World at Mardi Gras is full of Louisianians, right? We have transported a culture because so many people in Louisiana are on vacation while the rest of the country isn't, right? Um, so in that case, Places are defined by cultural practices. Language is spoken, identities enacted, rituals performed. And they often change as new people move in and out of these places, right? So we don't think about neighborhood cultures as fixed as we used to, um, but recognize instead that um, cultural spaces can be fluid. That is, they can change, right? And move. One set of postmodern spaces that are quite familiar to us are interactive media. These are, for example, MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role playing games like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy, Elder Scrolls Online, etc. Virtual worlds like Smeet, Caneva, or Ozworld, where people meet in real time and interact primarily for recreational purposes and with mobile devices. And really, any kind of game now that's interactive or any kind of social media that's interactive, right? Um, some of you have talked, for example, about finding communities online through Reddit or other social media networks, right? These are setting up cultural spaces. And so participants from multiple countries, cultures, and backgrounds can communicate across time zones in cultural, physical, and cyber spaces, right? So these cyber spaces become actual cultural spaces where people are interacting culturally and finding each other, right? Sometimes to build more homogenous cultural spaces where you can find people who are like you, right? Who might geographically be far away from you. So the fluid and fleeting nature of cultural spaces stands in sharp contrast to the 18th and 19th century notions of space, which promoted things like land ownership, surveys, borders, colonies, and territories. Cultural space exists only as long as it needs to in its present form. For that reason, postmodern cultural spaces are both tenuous and dynamic. Tenuous as in they can uh, collapse at any time, and dynamic as in they continue to change, right? They are created within existing places without following any particular guide, right? It's not like this is your neighborhood and these are the available spaces you can inhabit, right? No, right? We can create these new places because we don't need a physical space to do that. There is no marking off territory, no sense of permanence or official recognition. The postmodern cultural space exists only while it is used, right? So if you were on MySpace, you may have built a community there, a cultural space there, and it went away when MySpace went away, right? It may have shifted because it was dynamic and fluid and moved to other spaces like Facebook or Instagram, right? And it will move to other places because it only is going to exist as long as it's necessary and as long as it's used by actual people, right? The ideology of fixed spaces and categories is currently being challenged by postmodernist notions of space and location. The internet allows us to be located all over the world, right? Cultural spaces can also be metaphorical, with historically defined places serving as sources of contemporary identity negotiation in new spaces, right? So that is, right, a space doesn't have to be a physical space. It can be a metaphor for a place that isn't actually a place that we create for ourselves, a community, a culture that exists without place, right? Place is metaphorical in this case. So if you have questions, please contact me. I see questions pop up in the discussion board. I try to address them, but definitely shoot me an email and we can chat. Okay. I will see you next week.